community here, and many of them actually are moderators as well. Hello to all of the moderators. How are you? We're hitting that like button. We have 371 viewers, about 237 likes. Let's get that up to 300 likes. If we get to 300 likes, we can get more and more. We can get 50, 100 more. We can get more and more people into the stream. Let's do it. Everyone hit that thumbs up, hit that like button. Make sure you can leave a comment as well. You can share it. You can do so much to boost it, but liking this stream is the best way. Let's get to the first story, okay? So this happened yesterday. This news broke yesterday that the Biden administration, yesterday, January 18th, the Biden administration is warming to the possibilities that it will sanction, not sanction as in economically place sanctions on, but it will allow Ukraine to use U.S. weaponry and to use allied weaponry, NATO weaponry, to target Crimea. So this, for some context, this has not been something that necessarily the Biden administration has endorsed up until this point. And what do I mean by that? It's not that the United States hasn't promoted a narrative that Crimea is not Russia, that Russia should never have annexed Crimea, that Crimea is not Ukrainian territory. It's endorsed all of those things. It said, yes, we agree with Ukraine. We're with Ukraine on this issue, but it never believed that it would be useful to strike Crimea because that would lead possibly to Russian forces and possibly U.S. weaponry coming into conflict with each other and escalate the situation and lead to more more tensions and possibly a worsened conflict. So the United States hasn't been really open to this as much as you might have thought it would be, given that Ukraine hasn't been able to stop talking about this for months and months since the special military operation began, since Russia began its special military operation. And we've had attacks, right? You had the Crimea bridge attack. You also had the drone strikes on Sevastopol. You've had moment after moment, and the New York Times cites this. You've had moments where this has occurred, where Ukraine has maybe done what it wasn't told to do by the United States, but it has struck Crimea in the past, and now the United States is sanctioning it, meaning that it's giving a green light to possible attacks, which could lead to a higher risk of a NATO-Russia confrontation. So the New York Times says the Biden administration is considering the argument that Kiev needs the power to strike at the Ukrainian peninsula annex. That's a fancy word for saying Russia stripped it and took it away from Ukraine, when in reality there was a referendum. And in reality, historically, Crimea has been very connected to Russia, Russian people, Russian culture. But that's the propaganda narrative. So let's go through what the New York Times has to say. I think you will find it quite illuminating for a lot of the wrong reasons. So for years, the United States has insisted that Crimea is still part of Ukraine. Yet the Biden administration has held to a hard line since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, refusing to provide Kiev with the weapons it needs to target the Crimean Peninsula, which Russia has been using as a base for launching devastating strikes. Now that line is starting to soften. After months of discussions with Ukrainian officials, the Biden administration is finally starting to concede that Kiev may need the power to strike the Russian sanctuary, even if such a move increases the risk of escalation, according to several U.S. officials who spoke on the condition of anonymity to discuss a sensitive debate. Crimea, between the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov, is home to tens of thousands of dug-in Russian troops and numerous Russian military bases. White House officials insist there is no change in position. Crimea, they say, belongs to Ukraine. We have said throughout the war that Crimea is Ukraine, and Ukraine has the right to defend themselves and their sovereign territory in their internationally recognized borders, said Adrian Watson, spokesperson for the National Security Council. Privately, military and administration officials had questioned the utility of Ukraine focusing attacks on Crimea, arguing Kiev's military had better targets elsewhere on the battlefield. What that really means is that Ukraine was already at a disadvantage, so it should focus elsewhere because it would waste even probably faster the weapons that it had received from the United States. It would waste them even faster trying to target Ukraine, which its capabilities have been continuously diminishing given just how much Ukraine's military has blown through basically everything that it has been given up until this point. But the New York Times continues that the Biden administration has come to believe that if the Ukrainian military can show Russia that its control of Crimea can be threatened, that would strengthen Kiev's position in any future negotiations. In addition, fears that the Kremlin would retaliate using a tactical nuclear weapon have dimmed U.S. officials and experts said, though they have cautioned the risk has remained. So here we go. The New York Times is saying, and the foreign policy establishment, the blob, is saying, oh, yeah, the risk has dimmed. You remember in April, you remember when the peace talks were happening, the United States was sabotaging them, and they were saying Russia could use tactical nuclear strikes. Now they're saying, well, it's dimmed. And the only reason it's dimming is because they know Ukraine is in trouble and they have to pump Ukraine with more weapons and they have to have a pretext for that. And that is, oh, well, Crimea could be a good target now, but it doesn't have the capabilities. Ukraine doesn't have the capabilities. So let's give it the capabilities. This is what you call the calculating mind of a military industrial complex and of an empire. So the Times continues that the new thinking on Crimea, annexed illegally by Russia in 2014, shows how far the Biden administration officials have come from the start of the war, when they were more wary of even acknowledging publicly that the U.S. was providing Stinger anti-aircraft missiles for Ukrainian troops. But over the course of the conflict, the U.S. and its NATO allies has been steadily loosening the handcuffs they put on themselves, providing javelins and stingers to advanced missile systems, Patriot air defense systems, armored fighting vehicles, and even some Western tanks to give Ukraine the capacity to strike against the Russian onslaught. Mind you, this so-called increased capability has led to a stagnant defense line, a stagnant line of defense, which hasn't moved. Ukraine hasn't made any progress in months. So obviously there is a hint of desperation here. Now the Biden administration is considering what would be one of the boldest moves yet, helping Ukraine attack the peninsula that Vladimir Putin, Russian President Vladimir Putin, views as an integral part of his quest to restore past Russian glory. American officials are discussing with their Ukrainian counterparts the use of American-supplied weapons, from HIMARS rocket systems to Bradley fighting vehicles, to possibly target Vladimir Putin's hard-fought control over a land bridge that functions as a critical supply route connecting Crimea to Russia via the Russian-occupied cities of Melitopol and Mariupol. However, Biden is not yet ready to give Ukraine the long-range missile systems that Kiev would need to attack installations on the peninsula. So you have to read an article like this as a part of the pressure campaign to get this done. Because as you can see, it's citing these unnamed officials, some representatives coming out of the Biden administration, but it's really the entire foreign policy establishment saying, yeah, this is the way it should go. We should be giving Ukraine the capacity to target Crimea because we want Ukraine to commit attacks on Crimea, because that would be beneficial not just to the military-industrial complex, but it would also be beneficial to escalating this conflict and putting it into the territory of permanency. That's really been the plan all along, to try to keep this thing going. So Ukrainian officials, the Times continues, have long insisted that Crimea is an important target for their attacks, and that continuing military pressure on Russian bases there is significant to their strategy. And they've also discussed with American officials the importance of increasing pressure on Russia's rear echelon in Crimea, which supports military operations elsewhere. So with the Black Sea Fleet, a major Russian airbase, command posts, and logistic hubs supporting Russian operations in southern Ukraine, the peninsula presents a major focus in Kiev's battle plans. In deciding to give Bradleys to Ukraine, the Biden administration moved closer to providing Kiev with something for which senior Ukrainian officials have been imploring the United States for months: direct American help for Ukraine to go on the offense, including targeting Crimea. When we talk to Brian Berletic tomorrow, 1:20, so for you, those of you on the playback, you know that you can find that stream tomorrow, January 20th. We're going to talk about, well, is this actually doing all that much? Because it seems like no matter what Ukraine gets, and they have received many military packages, aid packages since then, they have received weapons, this Patriot battery, but it takes so much time. There's so many considerations, and time is not on Ukraine's side. You had Condoleezza Rice, Robert Gates, right? These deep state military foreign policy establishment hawks, these neocon hawks, say it themselves on the Washington Post that this isn't going fast enough. This needs to happen now. It needed to happen yesterday. It needed to happen months ago. So the Times continues that Frederick B. Hodges, a retired lieutenant general and former top U.S. Army commander in Europe, said that in the coming months, the Bradleys could be used by Ukrainian troops to help sever the land bridge. Being able to rely on military bases in Crimea for staging was the primary reason Russian forces were able to seize land in southern Ukraine last year, a U.S. official said. Making those forces less capable is a key battlefield goal of Ukraine. Ukraine could use the Bradleys to move forces down major roads, such as the M14, which connects Kherson, Melitopol, and Mariupol, said Seth G. Jones, a senior vice president at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And mind you, you just need to know about the CSIS, that it is funded by major military contractors. It is funded by the U.S. State Department. It is funded by the U.S. government, the Pentagon. It is a wing of the U.S. government, and it is basically a wing of the military state. So this is who they talk to, okay? This is who they talk to. So any Ukrainian infantry, he continues, advancing through these areas would face significant fire from Russian positions, and Bradleys offer helpful firepower for the protection of troops. The Bradleys, along with British tanks, 14 of them, that's the number, the armored combat vehicles that France and Germany have agreed to send, could be the vanguard of an armored force that Ukraine could employ in a counteroffensive this winter or spring, government independent analysts say. So Britain's Foreign Secretary James Cleverly said, "We think the time is now and it's right to intensify our support. We can't allow this to drag on and become some kind of First World War attritional type stalemate." But that's exactly what's happened. And actually, it's not a World War I attritional type stalemate in the same sense that now there's a flip side to this. The forces of resistance being Russia here, yes, it is not Ukraine. That's the force of resistance. Ukraine is a proxy of the United States. It's a proxy of NATO. Russia here is resisting NATO expansion. And unlike the First World War, Russia is defending itself and it's defending Donbass using limited kinds of warfare very effectively, while the United States is in the West are trying to throw everything they can at this, and it's not doing enough. And now they're getting to a point of no return of now we need to give everything up. We need to give Ukraine everything. And that, as you will see, poses risks, and they cite that. So if Ukraine, the Times continues, does focus on reclaiming, let's say, Zaporozhye, then parliamentary attacks could include hitting targets in nearby Crimea. A major Ukrainian breakthrough in Zaporozhye would seriously challenge the viability of Russia's land bridge, the British assessment said. Ukraine also had American HIMARS long-range rocket systems. With the reclaiming last year of Kherson in the south, Ukrainian forward lines can now use them to hit main supply routes coming out of Crimea, one American military official said this week in an interview. Also this week, top U.S. and Ukrainian commanders will hold high-level planning meeting in Germany to game out the offensive planning, another U.S. official said. The drill is meant to align Ukraine's battle plans with the kind of weapons and supplies NATO allies are contributing. So they're talking about planning this next step. They're trying to plan it out. They're trying to get Ukraine back to an offensive position. Will it work? Probably not, because it means escalating this to, again, a point of no return, to a point where you will possibly have Russia assess itself. Then it needs to escalate further. It needs to now put its partial mobilization in hyperdrive and deploy everything it has mobilized thus far. And it has been mobilizing quite a lot of weapons, quite a lot. It is getting ready for some kind of confrontation, offensive or defensive. And so that's a big problem for the United States. It really is a big calculation. What will they do? We cannot necessarily predict, but we know that there are problems with this plan. The big problem is that it all takes time to get the training ready, to get the manpower ready, and it's quite likely that Russia can mobilize in defense a lot quicker than the United States and its allies can get these weapons into operational control and operational use. So Ukrainian officials fear their country cannot survive years of a stalemated conflict while Russia continues to pound cities and towns. So they see little choice but to target Crimea and put it in jeopardy, a senior U.S. official said, noting that the issue has come up in a recent high-level meeting at the White House. So they're admitting that this could be years because of Ukraine's position. That doesn't sound like victory to me. It doesn't sound like Ukraine is ready to win and ready to take anything, let alone what it has already lost, which is 20 to 30% of eastern Ukraine, the Donbass, which doesn't want to be a part of Ukraine anyway, because what self-respecting people would want to be a part of a NATO protectorate that is literally backing the most reactionary forces in society? This isn't that difficult, but of course, U.S. and Western collective West propaganda has made it that difficult. So still, despite the additional weaponry, the Biden administration does not think Ukraine can take Crimea militarily, another admission. And indeed, there are still worries that such a move could drive Mr. Putin to retaliate with an escalatory response. But officials said their assessment now is that Russia needs to believe that Crimea is at risk, in part to strengthen Ukraine's position in any future negotiations. By demonstrating an ability to strike Crimea, American officials say Ukraine could show that Russian control is not established. The Biden administration also increasingly believes that hitting Russia's rear lines coming out of Crimea could severely damage Moscow's ability to push its front lines further, officials say. Without Crimea, the whole thing falls apart, says Evelyn Farkas, the top Pentagon official for Ukraine during the Obama administration. So don't you love that? The Obama administration is actually a big part of this, right? The Obama administration helped facilitate this coup. It was the leading force in the coup in Ukraine in 2014. And now it is continuing to advise the Biden administration to go harder and harder with its weaponry, with its attacks and escalations on Crimea. They're saying without Crimea, the whole thing falls apart. And they're not even saying that Ukraine's going to take back Crimea. They're just saying Russia needs to feel threatened in order to strengthen Ukraine's position. I don't know what kind of military strategy that is. Military strategy at the end of the day is not about optics, but yet the United States wants to make it about optics. And guess why? Well, the United States wants to fuel and pump the profits. It wants to maximize the profits of the military-industrial complex. Again, Ukraine doesn't matter because this only puts Ukraine in further danger. But the Times continues that contributing to the shift in thinking is a dampening fear of targeting Crimea, driving Mr. Putin, Vladimir Putin, to use a tactical nuclear weapon, officials say. It feels to me like increasingly the administration is recognizing that the threat of Russian escalation is perhaps not what they thought it was earlier. Oh, you mean when you propagandized and you tried to scaremonger people into believing that Russia was going to drop nuclear weapons in its own territory in order to show Ukraine that it means business, when that made absolutely no sense at all? That dropping a weapon in Donbass, like where would they drop it? In Kiev? No matter where you drop a nuclear weapon in Ukraine, it's going to massively impact Russia. It's going to massively impact the very forces that Russia is defending. What sense would it make? It's like if Syria, Bashar al-Assad would have actually used chemical weapons on his own people, would have destroyed the legitimacy of his own government. Never was going to happen. They lied to you again and again about Russia and nukes. And now they're saying, oh, the threat wasn't actually that bad. Let's just do this damn thing. Let's do it. So while Ukrainian strikes inside Russia proper still bring escalatory concerns from U.S. officials, Moscow's reaction to periodic Ukrainian special operations or covert attacks in Crimea, including against Russian air bases, command posts, and ships in the Black Sea Fleet, has been tempered. So here's the thing. They're trying to take advantage of Russia's reasonable responses to what's happened. There's already been terrorist attacks in Crimea. There's been strikes on Sevastopol. This is an admission that, oh, well, Russia, the RAND Corporation, another U.S. government think tank, or basically the research arm of the Pentagon, saying, oh, yeah, Russia tolerates these attacks. We can just strike Crimea. Nothing will happen. That's what they're trying to tell you in order to manufacture consent for war. Still, Vladimir Putin, the Russian public view, says the Times, view Crimea as part of Russia, so strikes could solidify Russian support for the war, obviously. For their part, U.S. officials say they don't know how Vladimir Putin will react if Ukraine attacks Crimea using American-supplied weapons. Mr. Massicot said that none of Ukraine's handful of attacks on Crimea so far have threatened Russia's ability to maintain its claims on the peninsula, so they may not be an accurate test of Russia's resolve at this point. So last month, you had Antony Blinken, Secretary of State, reiterate standing American policy on Ukraine that the Biden administration was seeking to help the country take back territory seized during and after the invasion last year. And so, it's trying to reiterate that, yeah, we're not trying to go back to 2014. We're trying to focus on what it needs right now to push back against Russian aggression since February 24th. A very legalistic position, right? Basically admitting that, yeah, no, we're not trying to basically wage a proxy war crusade to restore the borders of 2014, pre-2014. Actually, the truth is that they're doing something much more sinister, of course. They want regime change in Russia. They want destabilization of the region. They want Ukraine to be a NATO country. That's the ultimate objective. It's much worse than what they're saying they're not for. But at the same time, publicly, Antony Blinken has to say this, because the reality is that their agenda is not necessarily one that can find success at this moment. But the Time says that position, critics say, has largely given the Russian military an untouchable sanctuary from which to attack Ukraine. We have, in essence, here we go. This is, I love this person's name, Philip Breedlove, a retired 4-star Air Force general who was NATO's supreme allied commander for Europe when Russia invaded Crimea. Russia invaded Crimea in 2014. You gotta love the propaganda. Russia did not invade Crimea. Crimea literally asked for help. There was a coup regime happening. There was a proxy war already underway. There were coup forces, many of them far right, neo, and just ordinary NAZIs, committing absolute atrocities in Donbass. And the people of Crimea said, absolutely not. We're not going to be party to this. And they asked Russia for help. And Russia came in and they had a referendum. And that was that. But of course, here, Philip Breedlove says, well, we have in essence put limits on Ukraine, saying this war is going to be fought on your soil, not on Russian soil. To give Russia a sanctuary from which to fight without fear or reproach is absolutely absurd. It makes no military sense. That's the last thing the New York Times wants to tell you. So what do you think that means? That they have this retired 4-star Air Force general who is NATO's supreme commander under Obama, Philip Breedlove, obviously a hawk, literally telling you that it is ridiculous for the United States to allow Crimea to be used by Russia in this way. So what they're saying is that the U.S. should target Crimea through Ukraine. Ukraine should start to do this as soon as possible. And that, my friends, my comrades, my colleagues, everyone listening to this, all the viewers here, you wonderful viewers, you are essentially hearing the United States say through its mouthpieces, right? And look at all of them. Helen Cooper, Pentagon correspondent. Eric Schmidt, a former Pentagon correspondent. Julian E. Barnes, national security reporter based in intelligence agencies. You basically have the New York Times acting as a conduit for the Pentagon and the intelligence apparatus. What they are saying to you is that now there are serious considerations that whatever weapons package is finally announced by the U.S. and its NATO countries, probably sometime after tomorrow, not too long. Maybe it'll happen tomorrow. Maybe their talks have gone more successfully than we think they are. It seems that there seems to be a lot of division here, but nonetheless, whatever happens there, the strategy here, what they're saying is that they need to do a couple of things. They need to make sure that the optics are in place. So that means militarize Ukraine, fortify with whatever you can, pressure Germany to give tanks. Probably not going to happen. Get all the collective ones to give everything they can first, because the United States doesn't want to dip into its own stockpiles. And you'll see why with a recent story that also happened this week, that also was released this week. The United States doesn't want to do that. The United States does not want to dip into its own stockpiles. So what it's saying is it's going to try to get everything to Ukraine from NATO members that is acceptable to them, and hopefully they'll just comply. Not so sure that it's going to be 100% compliance, but nonetheless, fortify. Give them more HIMARS. Give them tanks are the big thing. Tanks. They want tanks. We'll see if they get them. But the point here is that the strategy is Crimea. The strategy is let's get even closer. You already have Ukraine at times striking Russian territory, mostly in the Donbass, but even close to Russia's borders proper, right? You do have that activity happening. Now they want to go for what really is a deeper red line, Crimea. And that may say to Russia, well, this threat of a global confrontation with the United States and NATO is not just worse than we thought. It's actually here right now in this particular conflict, in this particular stage of the conflict. Well, we have to engage. And that could precipitate further escalations. That's why I say the U.S. is preparing for World War III, because these are the conditions that you build, that you create in order to do that at some point in the future. I'm not saying it's happening tomorrow, not saying it's happening the next day, but when you have the United States green light Ukrainian attacks using US and NATO weaponry to do so, that sends a signal that this conflict is not just one that they want to be permanent, but one that they want, that the US and the foreign policy establishment want to turn even further into a full frontal, a full scale confrontation with Russia, which is the definition of what World War III, or really a great power conflict, or a sort of new global conflagration, that's what it will look like. That's what it would look like. It would look like the United States and NATO engaging Russian forces directly, and moving it into build up to that, you do so indirectly. And that's what the Ukraine proxy war has been all about from the beginning. And now we're seeing 2023 start to develop the rudiments of this. However, one thing that's important to note is that the United States is not a lion, right? It's not a king. It's not a kingmaker. It is no longer in a position to just get what it wants whenever it wants. NATO either, right? As an extension of US imperial power. Neither of them are. Now you are seeing the limits already come into place where you have, or come into play where you have this narrative. You have the optics. They want to show but even in this New York Times article, they say they can't do it. Ukraine will never be able to do it militarily. But Russia needs to believe they can. And that's how suicidal the US's endless war regime is, because it's not about necessarily winning or losing. It's just about the neocon strategy, as well as what will make the money, what will have to pay dividends to the US empire in the future. And they believe building up to a global confrontation, a world war with Russia, by escalating this Ukraine conflict to Crimea, by making this what it always was, an extension of the 2014 coup of this proxy war, well, the United States is saying, okay, conditions aren't good right now. We got to do everything we can to ensure that the tide turns. Well, guess what? The tide is not turning. What the U.S. is actually doing is causing the world to burn. So the tide isn't turning, but the world is indeed burning because of this. So that is the escalation. That is the escalation. That is where the United States and NATO are focusing on their World War III, you could call it. May not be so precise. I do enjoy when people debate about the utility of using a World War III label on the global situation. But that is where in Ukraine you can see this happening. You can see the US and NATO actually escalating, and escalating really hard. But I want to cover another story real quick. And this story is important too, because it does show these limitations pretty profoundly. All right, these are profound limitations that the collective West is facing. One of the reasons why the United States and NATO are talking so much about militarizing Ukraine even further, they're talking so much about giving Ukraine heavy weaponry, tanks, HIMARS, right, artillery, is because Ukraine is basically out. They're basically burned out of their pre-existing weaponry given to Ukraine throughout this conflict, but really a lot of it, they were fortified with all that lethal aid. You remember that? Well, Ukraine actually had a decent military capacity on February 24, 2022, and now that's essentially gone. And the United States and NATO has tried to refortify Ukraine, but it hasn't been able to get the job done. And so now you hear the sirens. That's been happening all night. So the United States has been, and NATO has been fortifying Ukraine as best they can to get it back to February 24, 2022 levels. Hasn't been able to, it hasn't happened, right? And so after the Kherson offensive, Kharkov, after these minor victories, you could say, victories, but really temporary victories, the reality set in. Ukraine poured everything, all of these weapons, all of this manpower. We're talking about tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of troops potentially dead. It's probably 200,000. A lot of that happened in these offensives. And after the offensives, after the dust cleared, Ukraine could plant their little blue and yellow flag that the liberals and the neocons and the foreign policy establishment hangers on that they love to put in their windows. Ukraine's military could plant their little flags and their little black sun of Azov, all of that on that territory, only to find themselves with nothing left. I mean, that's literally what's happened. And so the situation is so bad militarily for Ukraine. And this is how it has to be talked about. This is just the reality. And people much smarter than me about military situations, like Brian Berletic, like Scott Ritter, they've been saying this for a long time. But now we're seeing a level of desperation I don't think we might have been able to predict just 6 months ago. And that is this. The Pentagon is sending U.S. arms stored in Israel to Ukraine. You heard that, right? Israel, right, as basically a military outpost of the United States. That's how Israel maintains and expands, right, its dominance, not just over Palestine, but its attempt to expand in the region as well as a world regional power, colonial one. But Israeli officials had initially concerns about this move damaging relations with Russia. You had the new government that was just, I don't even know what they do in Israel. They say elections, but I don't know what it is a government that basically is Netanyahu every several years. Like that's how it feels to me. This only democracy in the Middle East thing. It seems like the Zionists just have a one trick pony. It's like sometimes they get Netanyahu and then sometimes they get someone far to the right of Netanyahu, and then it comes back to Netanyahu. So it seems like Netanyahu has a pretty deep hold over politics in Israel, not necessarily democracy, you would assume. So, but Israel has all these weapons from the United States, right? It has weapons that the United States literally stores that only the United States has access to. And now the United States is saying, give us the weapons. You could use them in emergencies, but now you got to give us the weapons because you're not in an emergency. Palestine's not an emergency. The Middle East is an emergency. Ukraine's an emergency. Give us the weapons. So here you go. The Times says the Pentagon is tapping into a vast but little known stockpile of American ammunition in Israel to help meet Ukraine's dire need for artillery shells in the war with Russia, says American and Israeli officials. The stockpile provides arms and ammunition from the Pentagon to use in Middle East conflicts. The United States has also allowed Israel to access these supplies in emergencies. So You have Ukraine running low on munitions of its Soviet-era weaponry. They admit. So here you have the Western media actually admitting that Ukraine is not in a great situation in it because it's become an artillery-driven war. This has become a war that is fought in the trenches, that is fought man to man. This is not the kind of war the United States has ever really specialized in. Defeat after defeat after defeat in other places. But let's move on. So artillery constitutes the backbone of ground combat firepower for both Ukraine and Russia, and the war's outcome may hinge on which side runs out of ammunition first, says military analysts. So with stockpiles in the United States strained and American arms makers not yet able to keep up the pace of Ukraine's battlefield operations, the Pentagon has turned to two alternatives to supply shells to bridge the gap, one in South Korea and one in Israel, whose use in the Ukraine war has not been previously reported. So the Times is breaking the story saying the U.S. is also not able to keep up because, and you'll see, basically in terms of ammunition, artillery, Ukraine is basically using up in a few weeks what the United States is able to make in several months to a year. I mean, this is how bad it is getting. So the shipment of hundreds of thousands of artillery shells from two stockpiles to help sustain Ukraine's war effort is a story about the limits of America's industrial base and the diplomatic sensitivities of two vital U.S. allies that have publicly committed not to send lethal military aid to Ukraine. So Israel has consistently refused to supply weapons to Ukraine out of fear of damaging relations with Moscow and initially expressed concerns about appearing complicit in arming Ukraine if the Pentagon drew its munitions from the stockpile. About half of 300,000 rounds destined for Ukraine have already been shipped to Europe and will eventually be delivered through Poland, said American and Israeli officials. So this is on the way. 150,000 artillery shells from Israel, U.S. stockpiles that are just there. They are going to Ukraine from Poland. As senior defense and military officials from dozens of nations, including NATO states, prepare to meet at Ramstein Air Base in Germany on Friday to discuss sending Ukraine more tanks and other arms, U.S. officials have been scrambling behind the scenes to cobble together enough shells to keep Kiev sufficiently supplied this year, including through an anticipated spring offensive. With the front line now mostly stationary, artillery has become the most important combat art, said Mark F. Kanchan, a former White House weapons strategist, said in a new study for the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. So let me just show you. That's twice. This is what the New York Times relies on, this kind of information. Let me just show you who CSIS really is. Oh, it looks like I ended the screen. Let me share with you, okay, what is CSIS? Well, it's a think tank, yeah, but who is in control of this think tank? You may know this, but the donors are actually quite extensive. And so I'm just on the main donors page, and they get it from foundations, from corporate donors, and from government donors. So this is from 2020 numbers. Let's look at the government donors, shall we? Well, here you have the government donors, and let's zoom this in so you all can see. All right. U.S. government and government of Japan, $500,000 and up. And then the government of Taiwan and the UAE are the second most. Then you have Denmark, Norway, Qatar, Republic of Korea, the ROK. You have all the Western countries, the European Union. That's the government side of things, okay? So basically a U.S. government-controlled think tank. So basically an arm of the Pentagon, essentially. Let's look at the foundations, shall we? Of course, you have Bill and Melinda Gates, and you have all kinds of other rich people. Then you have the Academy of Korean Studies. You have a lot of these foundations that seem to be just extensions of the military-industrial complex. The Charles Koch Foundation is in there, always good. Open Society Foundation, of course, you have George Soros, never misses an opportunity to fund a good war effort. But now let's look at the corporate donors, because not only is the U.S. government the main supplier of the CSIS's funds, but who are the corporate partners? Ding, 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 ding. Bank of America, Northrop Grumman Corporation. So basically Wall Street and the military-industrial complex. And then, of course, you have the rest of the banks. You have the oil corporations, which love a good war because war means more energy deals for them. And Lockheed Martin is in here, General Atomics. So basically you have the trifecta. That's what CSIS is. CSIS is a U.S. government-controlled, military-industrial complex-controlled, and Wall Street-controlled think tank that literally provides the New York Times that you just saw. This is the second article I am presenting here, and it's CSIS being one of the principal sources of information. This is really what the media military-industrial complex looks like. So another analysis published last month by Foreign Policy Research Institute. Well, that sounds really how should I say, credible, right? The Foreign Policy Research Institute. But if you look, also, I'm not going to pull it up here, but the Foreign Policy Research Institute is literally, the president is former CIA. So there is no objectivity here. It is all about forwarding the war narrative. So the Foreign Policy Research Institute said that if Ukraine continued to receive a steady supply of ammunition, particularly for artillery, as well as spare parts, it would stand a good chance of wresting back more territory Ukraine that Russia had seized from Ukraine. The question is whether these advantages will prove sufficient for Ukrainian forces to retake territory from entrenched Russian troops. So there you have just a circle, right? You have these leading military analysts, Rob Lee and Michael Kaufman, saying, well, we don't know if what we do will actually push Ukraine over the edge to where they need to be in a winning position. But then you have the other think tank saying, no, it will. So that's the debate here. The debate is, well, okay, we should give the weapons because it's good for military contractors. It's good for a permanent war. But will it actually do anything? I don't know. Probably not. Then you have others saying, oh, yes, you have the real enthusiasts who are saying, yes, we can do it. I mean, these are people who don't understand the conflict. They just have the same eyes as their so-called the other side of the debate, but they are just either diluting themselves into believing this, or they're just using this narrative as the other side of the coin, right? You always have to have in the United States two sides of the same coin, whether it's the two parties, the neocons, the neoliberals. You have to have two sides of the same coin, but really they serve all the same interests. So arming the Ukrainian military with enough ammunition is part of a larger American-led effort to increase its overall combat power by providing more precision long-range weapons, Western tanks, and armored fighting vehicles, and combined arms training. The U.S. so far has sent or pledged to send Ukraine just over 1,155mm shells. A portion of that, though less than half, has come from stockpiles in Israel and South Korea, a senior U.S. official said, speaking on the condition of anonymity. And here you have, I'm not going to spend too much longer on this. The Ukraine army uses about 90,000 artillery rounds a month, twice the rate they are being manufactured by the U.S. and European countries combined. U.S. and Western officials say the rest must come from other sources, including existing stockpiles and commercial sales. So Mr. Kaufman said in an interview that without adjustments to how Ukraine fights, future Ukrainian offensives might require significantly more artillery and ammunition to make progress against entrenched Russian defenses. The U.S. is making up the difference from its stockpiles, but that is not a sustainable solution. So here you have him saying, the New York Times is saying, it means the U.S. is taking on risk elsewhere if it reduces its own stockpiles. So it's going to dangerously low levels, and that's why the U.S. has promised that it will replenish what it takes, and it's going to take these 150,000 artillery shells to Ukraine through Poland, and it's going to also soothe its allies' wounds and say, don't worry, baby, I'm coming back. I'll be back. Baby daddy will be back. That's basically what the U.S. is saying. Don't you worry. We're not going to leave you to be completely helpless against those terrible Palestinians who want their freedom and their self-determination. We're not going to leave you to your own defenses against the Arab world, the Arab nations, and the nations in the Middle East that want to see peace. Well, we'll be back to help fuel war there. Don't worry. But now we got to take this to the side piece. And really what's happened is that Ukraine has become the side piece in this. That Israel has become the side piece in this relationship. Israel is not as important to the United States right now as Ukraine is, because Ukraine is all about great power competition, and Israel is about that old war, right? That old war for hegemony in the Middle East. So that's the situation. And so they're confident that they're going to continue to support Ukraine, blah, 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 blah. The conclusion here is that they're not going to discuss this. Israel was trying to not allow this to happen, but it's happening. And, the United States has kept these stockpiles here in South Korea, in Israel, right? Because it was fighting existing wars. And I'm just going to end this article because there's not much else that it's going to say that we don't already know. The New York Times has a tendency to repeat itself over and over and over again in its articles. I don't know if you've noticed that, but it really drives me. It's terrible reading. But the point here is that Israel is going to give 150,000 artillery shells. South Korea, another 150,000. They think, the United States thinks that's going to help Ukraine do what it needs to do, right? Which is to survive until the U.S. and the collective West can figure out, well, how much are they going to give? How much are they going to give to Ukraine to get ready for some offensives in the future? The problem is that time is not on Ukraine's side. Russia has the capacity to mobilize very quickly in the coming weeks if it so chooses. So this is really about strategy, because we know what Russia's strategy has been. It's been about attrition. It's been about grind, right? The meat grinder, grinding Ukraine down. We know Russia's goals are just to take out Ukraine's military and make sure that Ukraine can't join NATO and hopefully end this. We know that Russia genuinely, given that it did act in good faith in April, and there was almost a peace deal until Britain and the US sabotaged it. But we know that since December 2021, that Russia has wanted a negotiated settlement to this. Now, they've definitely concluded, and that's why this could become a patriotic war or a war for, dare I say, national liberation. When you have a situation where the United States and NATO have no interest. They have no interest in coming to the table. They only will come to the table when Russia's on its knees. That's essentially what they've said over and over and over again. So really, you have a scenario where the United States and NATO are trying to get their stuff together. They're trying to get themselves together. But Russia, we'll have to really watch closely what Russia does, especially in the next several months as these weapons announcements are coming. We've heard Peskov, you've heard many Russian officials say that these weapons will burn, they will be targeted, they will be destroyed, just like any of the other early Soviet weapons. Russia's not going to allow these weapons to gain an advantage on the battlefield. And the big question here, I think the big problem here actually for the collective West is that these weapons will not turn the tide. That not only is there not a guarantee that they will, it's likely that the best that these weapons can do, Chinese media has made note of this, the best that these weapons can do is likely to prolong the conflict and make things more dangerous between Russia and NATO. It's not going to ensure Ukraine can win because Russia does have the capabilities of targeting these weapons, of destroying them. And even if it cannot target or destroy them, it does have manpower advantages. And it also has an industrial base that can continue to produce for its military. Russia is not fighting this as an all-out war, and the United States has forced Ukraine to do so. That's been the difference this whole time. Ukraine has had to use everything, all of its men, all of its soldiers, all of its military hardware. There's only so long that can go on. Russia's in it for the long game. We'll have to watch very closely how these developments, which really seem like desperation, especially this Israel story, feels like desperation. We'll have to see where that goes. All right, everyone. That's the end of that story for you all. We have one more story coming up, and that is the next war, okay? This is, to me, something that isn't getting enough attention, and I definitely want you all to be aware of what is happening. And I wrote an article on Substack, and we're going to get to that very soon. But we have 686 viewers in this stream. Welcome, everyone. Welcome, beautiful people. You want to like this stream. So we have 521 likes. Let's get to 600 likes. Can we do that in the next 5, 10, 15 minutes? Because if we do, we get more people in this stream getting this information and correcting the misinformation. Of course, to support this work, you can subscribe on patreon.com/Dhaiphong. You can become a YouTube member as well. You can also check out the links in the description, but the best way is on Patreon. I do have equipment needs. I do have a lot of things. I have more people helping me out now. I do want to provide some kind of payment for them, but funds are low. So please do consider supporting this work in whatever way you can monetarily, whether it's on Patreon, whether it's on YouTube, whether it is through the links. But Patreon is the best way. If you can only do one-time donations, there's plenty of options in the description of this video as well. But supporting this for free is also great because I do appreciate all of you who are able to do that. So, of course, getting these likes up, subscribing to the channel, hitting that notifications bell, and if you can't subscribe annually on Substack for a paid membership, do sign up to the newsletter. It's in the description. You want to sign up for that newsletter because you will get alerts every time I am live. You can also do that on Telegram. I didn't share my Telegram information, t.me/Dhaiphong, but you can also do that on Telegram because I always alert people on Telegram as well. And Telegram's a great alternative. It's in the chat now. It's a great alternative to Twitter, which will probably not last very long for me, or at least I don't see myself probably as a permanent person on Twitter, given the censorship I've already incurred there. But this channel is being censored, everyone. So you have to know that the algorithm does not like these subjects. They don't like these topics. They don't like to talk about war. They don't, we're using platforms that are in the hands of the very forces fueling these things. So you want to be sure to get on these alternative platforms, support financially if you can, but also if you're not able to be following this work on places like Substack. Speaking of Substack, let's get to the next story because I wanted to cover my article on Substack about this very issue. So here we go. The link is in the chat, everyone, if you want to follow the article. All right, let's get going. Let's get this going. So this is something I've been following because I don't think many people have been. We will see the Duran, they reacted to this as well. I'll play a bit of what they had to say about it. When we get, we'll get to that point. Maybe I'll play that at the end. But first, let's cover the article because it's basically a summary. I'm not going to go over the whole thing, but I want to summarize each instance of what was happening this week. Or not this week, but what's been happening to begin 2023. It seemed like the New Year's celebration happened and the foreign policy establishment concluded that the United States is not just in a two-front war, preparing for a two-front war with Russia and China because of all of its interests in doing so, right? Curbing these rising powers to the east, making sure that China's economy doesn't surpass the United States's, making sure that an example like a socialist governance system with a market-based economy can't thrive because of how that is allowing other countries to assert their sovereignty, right? It doesn't want de-dollarization, doesn't want any of these things, and we'll get to this in the article. But it's not only because of that. It's because the situation, the landscape is not so favorable right now. Meaning that, as we have talked about on this channel a lot, the Ukraine proxy war is exactly that. It's a proxy war, but it's one that doesn't have any end in sight, right? And that's not a good position for the United States to be in because the United States, sure, can continue to allow its contractors to make, all of these profits. It can continue to have Wall Street kind of finance this and become, into to loot Ukraine and all that. That's all good and fine. But the problem with the permanent war is that it can become a quagmire. It can become one that exposes the overextension and overreach of the U.S.'s capabilities. And that's exactly what the United States' foreign policy establishment is considering. You saw it in that article. You saw it when it came to the U.S. is depleting military armaments, right? Its stockpiles. Its stockpiles are depleted, and they're worried about the foreign policy blob, are worried about the militarists. They're worried about not being able to fight elsewhere. So what does the foreign policy establishment do? Well, it's going hard on a propaganda war to build up to the next war, which is with China. The next war is with China. Ukraine is just the beginning. It's just the beginning. Russia is just the beginning. And so here I wrote on Substack, the U.S. is already preparing for the next war. We have war strategists, pundits, and experts setting their sights on China. So I talk about the Ukraine is turning 1 year next month. And mind you, this channel is going to have great guests hopefully next month to kind of go over this 1 year into the Ukraine proxy war. But nonetheless, Ukraine is turning one. This proxy war is turning one next year, at least the special military operation side of it. Of course, this started in 2014. But now you see that anything resembling victory, right? Winter's here, and Ukraine's prospects for victory are dissipating if they really ever existed. And so you had this incredible article by Condoleezza Rice. You remember her, right? Huge proponent of the war in Iraq. She served on Bush's National Security Council as Secretary of State for a bit. And then you have Robert Gates, who's been a CIA director. He's also been in the foreign policy establishment for a while. Both of them came together, and they were on op-ed for the Washington Post saying time is not on Ukraine's side and that the U.S. needs to act fast. And it needs to do this because neocon hawks like Rice and Gates cannot even imagine a negotiated settlement. They don't want a negotiated settlement. They can't even imagine such a thing. So the only option for the U.S.'s political and military establishment is to fortify Ukraine with the heaviest weapons. And so Brian Berletic, who will be on this show January 20th, and you can find his interviews with me in the past. He's a friend of the show and regular guest. The United States is burning through, right? So it produces about 30,000 rounds per year of 155 millimeter howitzer long range systems, and Ukraine has used those in 2 weeks of fighting. So in 1 year, this weapon alone, this weapon system alone is being burned in 2 weeks by Ukraine. That's how bad things have gotten. And so, of course, Zelensky must have been disappointed when he went to Congress and Biden told him to his face. Well, actually, he was kind of turned away from him, but he basically presented to the crowd, to Congress, that no, I don't want to do anything that NATO doesn't accept, right? That NATO doesn't want to get into a direct conflict with Russia, so I'm not going to give you more than the $45 billion I promised you, guy, right? Jack, as Biden would probably say. So, Russia's taking Soledar. They're getting ready to take Bakhmut. There's many battles happening right now where Russia's doing quite well on that front line. And the foreign policy establishment is worried that its capacity to wage war is being depleted elsewhere. And so no other issue is more important than China here. We have to understand that China is the big target. It's the big fish. It's the one that the United States wants to hit and hit the hardest, but understands in terms of the contradiction, that it's in no position to do so. But nonetheless, you've had, like the Rand Corporation, I said, a research arm of the Pentagon, has called China a peer competitor, meaning that it is not necessarily a rogue state, they say, but it's one whose competition is a direct threat, and it's the greatest long-term threat to the United States. Joe Biden's Secretary of Defense, former Raytheon board member Lloyd Austin, called China the greatest threat to the U.S.'s security. All of this happened. This happened this year. NATO labeled China a malicious actor in the alliance's latest strategic concept document, and that happened in June 2022 during the summit. And it pledged to play a larger role in curbing the so-called threats presented by China's rise. But I break down, and it's an incredible article, this article in Foreign Policy magazine that I cite here, where it blows off all the lids to the subtlety of this plan for war with China. It has 12 essays and contributions from all corners of the foreign policy establishment in the United States, including Obama CIA director and former U.S. Army commander in Afghanistan, David Petraeus, war criminal. You have another war criminal, NATO Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen, and former Undersecretary of State in Trump-era NATO Secretary General Rose Gottmuller. So you have basically NATO and this war criminal, not to mention a whole bunch of other unsavory characters that we'll get into. But these forces are leading the charge for calling for war with China, and it's mostly over Taiwan. But really, what they're saying is we got to prepare for this bigger war with China. So they cover areas like cyber, economic war, cyber war, military, direct conflict, diplomatic, and propaganda war. And so the big important thread here is that they want to spread the propaganda that not even the New York Times will spread right now, or at least they've tempered it a bit, where they're spreading that Russia has basically failed in Ukraine. But there's so many lessons that we can learn. So they want to say that Russia is weak and that Russia overplayed its hand and that Russia is on the verge of defeat. However, none of that is true. But this is the only way they can present the next war as being plausible. So this preparation for World War III is only plausible if Russia is looked to made to look weak. And so Stephen Thiel, I'm sure I didn't look this up, but I'm sure he's a part of the big Thiel dynasty, this hugely wealthy family, but he's the chief editor, and he says, quote, drawing the right lessons from the first 10 months of the Russian invasion not only matters for Ukraine, it's also vital for deterring and preventing a future conflict and, if necessary, fighting one. The most obvious potential hotspot, and one that involves the greatest stakes, of course, is Taiwan. So there you go. That's how the article opens up into this 12-essay marathon on why the United States needs to go to war. And so you have this lip service to deterrence, which is incredibly disgusting in my view, because this is not about deterrence prevention. You have David Petraeus in his co-authored piece. He writes, this is a guy who has literally been in charge of bombing weddings and mosques in civilian areas in Afghanistan, saying, he says, quote, Ukraine points to the imperative of the United States and its Indo-Pacific allies to prioritize the near-term ability to field large numbers of relatively inexpensive, highly mobile anti-ship and anti-air missiles that can be dispersed and maneuvered throughout the first and second island chains against Beijing's increasingly formidable naval and air forces. Large quantities of unmanned air, sea, and ground systems can amplify these missiles in the U.S. order of battle. So literally, this is military speak. This is planning for war with China. There's no doubt about it. And in other words, the U.S. is saying that it's David Petraeus is saying that the U.S.'s $858 billion military budget, which we know is much larger than that because so much money is unaccounted for, must grow even larger to challenge China. And he's a war criminal. And I just mentioned that, and I mentioned that in the article, that he is literally responsible for killing women, children, men, and all human beings, civilians, in mosques, in weddings, just absolutely grotesque war crimes. But nonetheless, he's saying, well, we've got to move on to the next area where war crimes must be committed, and that is against China. So then you have the former NATO Secretary Anders Fogh Rasmussen backing up Petraeus, saying that, quote, weapons are what counts when it comes to Taiwan. With the help of its partners, Taiwan must become a porcupine bristling with armaments to deter any possible attempt to take it by force. China must calculate that the cost of an invasion is simply too high to bear. So essentially, right, again, war is peace, right? So if we can wage and escalate, basically build up to a war with China, China will less likely want to wage a war on Taiwan. This is how they like to speak. But of course, it's all imperial doublespeak for getting ready for this confrontation. So foreign policy war stenographers clarify that preparing for war with China is much more than just weapons. It's about much more than weapons. So you have Maria Shagina, a research fellow on sanctions at the Weapons Industry and State Department funded International Institute for Strategic Studies, arguing that the U.S. and its allies should devise a coherent plan of economic statecraft against China as soon as possible. And let me just show you who or what I should say the International Institute for Strategic Studies is, because you may not have heard about it before. This is a think tank that is less known, but here we go. It's a less known think tank, and it's not often that people pay attention to it. But here you have a list of the funders, okay? Those who give sponsorship and royalties and membership funds to this. And look at the top funders here. This is basically the military industrial complex. Who do you see here? And let's see, is it too small? Let me see. Let me even, BAE Systems, Boeing, General Atomics Aeronautical Systems, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin. I mean, and then we can go to Northrop Grumman Corporation is in the second tier. And then you have all Chevron, of course, the British Army, of course, right? A Japan Bank, of course. All right, you have just institution after institution, Dow Chemical of the UK. You know, you can go on and on and on. But nonetheless, the most important thing here is that you see that it is actually an arm of the military industrial complex, essentially. Those are the biggest funders, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, etc. So that's who we're hearing speak through the Foreign Policy magazine. So let me go back to the article now. And then you have Elizabeth Braw of the Carlyle Group funded American Enterprise Institute proposing that the U.S. and its allies should control information airwaves to ensure citizens, quote, know exactly what to look for, end quote, from so-called subversive state and non-state actors that counter U.S. and NATO talking points. And I said, you know, these are already happening. These preparations have already happened in many ways. And they're just being escalated through calls like this, through articles like this. You know that the United States, you may know the United States spends hundreds of millions of dollars, I believe up to $500 million on information warfare against China, funding the U.S. Agency for Global Media, institutions like Radio Free Asia, which is a former CIA cutout. You already have that information warfare going on, human rights atrocity propaganda, think Adrian Zenz. And then you also have sanctions on China already, whether it's on Huawei, right, the huge tech giant, whether it's on the trade war, or whether there's a whole blacklist of tech corporations, Chinese tech corporations that have been blacklisted. You also have human rights related sanctions on things like Xinjiang cotton, Xinjiang polysilicon, which has actually hurt the U.S. economy. But you also have these huge Chinese semiconductor export bans, which really is very counterproductive. It only hurts the overall tech industry. But nonetheless, that's what's happening. And so these preparations that they're calling for, what they're really saying is we need to do more. We need this to get worse. So Foreign Policy's article is part of a flurry of indications that the U.S. foreign policy establishment is preparing for war with China. Just 2 days following Foreign Policy's article, top U.S. general in Japan, James Bierman, made the stunning admission in the Financial Times that the U.S. is setting the theater of war by goading China into a Ukraine-style war over Taiwan. The next day, the Center for Strategic International Studies released a war simulation between the U.S. and China over Taiwan. So again, war simulation. You have the top general in Japan saying, yeah, the United States, everything it's doing in the Asia-Pacific is setting the theater of war with China. And we've already had conclusions like this come from, you've already had war simulations and tests and conclusions that this is going to happen from way back earlier in May of 2022 from the Center for New American Security, another Pentagon and think tank, Pentagon and arms manufacturer industry funded think tank, which went on NBC's Meet the Press and literally did a war simulation with the U.S. fighting China over Taiwan. And so, of course, it's always the conclusions are always, oh, this is going to be a bloody battle and everyone's going to lose probably, but China will receive a lot of damage, and that's great, right? That's kind of what you get out of the conclusions from these war stenographers. Nonetheless, I say it's important to note that this has very little to do with China. So you have all these preparations. You have the CSIS preparing for war with war simulations. You have top general James Bierman in Japan, U.S. general, saying, yes, we are setting the theater for war. When you set a theater for war, you are going to play, right? That's basically what he said. Asia Pacific, you've seen it. Militarization, 400 plus military bases, all of it, right? Aggressive postures toward China, sailing warships through the Taiwan Straits, South China Sea, on and on and on. We can go on and on and on. And then you had the foreign policy article literally gathering together the top war stenographers in these think tanks in the former foreign policy establishment, right? These veterans of war. You gather them all together and you have them tell you that you tell their readers and tell the general public, they're hoping, although I doubt many people read Foreign Policy Magazine, to be honest, outside of war enthusiasts, but they want to get out the message to who they're really writing to, which is the establishment, that it's time for war with China. And so this is not about Taiwan, even though they say Taiwan, got to protect Taiwan, got to protect democracy in Taiwan. What they really are responding to is imperial decline, their own decline, the collective West's unraveling, in the United States' decline in particular, and also the rise of China and Russia happening simultaneously. And so I say that Russia and China present their own individual challenges to U.S. hegemony. That is Russia's growing sovereignty and political independence, which goes in direct contradiction to the Wolfowitz doctrine post-1991, where you had a doctrine, the U.S. military strategy for Russia was not necessarily to wage war on Russia directly, but to weaken it so much so, fragment it so much so that it would never be able to assert sovereignty ever again. That is actually being challenged direly by Russia at the moment. And then you have China's massive socialist government-led market economy set to surpass the United States by 2035. So that's individually, right? And there's, of course, more than that. There's the fact that the United States is unable to meet the needs of its own people, so it has to project out to China and Russia in order to meet these geopolitical aims. And you also have the fact that China and Russia also do things their own way. And what do I mean by that? Well, it's also domestically, yes, Russia with its nationalized sectors around energy, right? It has big markets that the U.S. wants to get its hands on. Russia won't allow it. China the same way. China has nationalized markets, huge infrastructure sectors that are not touchable from Western and U.S. corporations. They can't dominate it. They can't suck it up. They can't eat it and spit it out. They can't privatize it. But worse, I think, is that Russia and China are growing closer together. In economic terms, you have a comprehensive strategic partnership between these two countries that has grown leaps and bounds since their 2001 Treaty of Good Neighborliness and Friendly Cooperation Agreement. Since that time, we've had a total volume of 200 billion US dollars being set as a trade target by 2024. That's ahead of schedule. And I think the number now is about 180 billion right now. And it's expected to increase bilateral trade, that is, to increase by 25%. So you have these surging economic ties helping Russia protect itself from EU sanctions from this war, the US and EU sanctions. And you have agriculture and energy exports to China from Russia increasing by the month. And you also have increased coordination between Russia and China on matters of things like military coordination, color revolutions, and diplomacy in the face of a common threat. So you have these two countries coming together in a common way to fight off and ward off the threat of imperialism. But the biggest threat here is not that, really. The biggest threat is that there's a global movement for integration and de-dollarization that China and Russia is leading. They're leaders in institutions like the BRICS Plus mechanism and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, both of which are setting the foundations for a dollar or free world, or at least a world independent of the US dollar. So what they do is they strengthen investment in all sectors of economic and social development between the partner nations with the ability to do so in their own currencies. So when you have starvation sanctions on Russia, predatory loans from Western financial institutions hurting the entire global South, you have BRICS Plus uniting these countries, the largest global South countries of Brazil, Russia, India, and China, and South Africa, in an effort to really develop an alternative. You have the petrodollar being challenged because these institutions are expanding. So BRICS Plus in particular, right? It grew immensely last year. You had Saudi Arabia, Algeria, Iran, Argentina, and several other countries express interest in or directly apply, like Iran did, like Argentina did. And you have Saudi Arabia and Algeria on their way probably to join this BRICS Plus mechanism. And this has only complemented, so this is all connected. It's complemented these integration projects that Russia and China are leading on their own. You have the infrastructure. So you cannot just have a de-dollarized economy, world economy, without having independent infrastructure development. You need to build new economic institutions and new infrastructure from which those institutions can conduct and facilitate trade and economic relations. And that's what's happening. Belt and Road Initiative through China, right? It supports major cooperation agreements with nearly all of the world, 140 countries out of what, 189, 198? So nearly the entire world has signed on to this, with 2,000 development initiatives either completed or under construction. And you have talks now of possibly Russia's Eurasian Economic Union and the Belt and Road Initiative, the Russia's Eurasian Economic Union, including countries like Belarus, I believe is it Kazakhstan that's in that. It's a smaller arrangement, but it mainly focuses on the Eurasian Caucasus region as well as Belarus and some direct allies. But they're very similar projects about building infrastructure. And now they're talking about, Russia and China are talking about coming together and possibly merging these two initiatives. The corporate media used to say, the Western media used to say, oh, they're divided. These countries are divided. Well, think again. So the most interesting thing, I think, and then I'll conclude here, is that you have people like Zoltan Parsar, not just the Foreign Policy magazine, which in that essay I cited, did sound the alarm that U.S. sanctions are leading China and Russia to pursue alternatives to the dollar with its trading partner. We have this gentleman, Zoltan Parsar. He's an economist, a former strategist at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. So he's a Wall Street guy. And he's saying that BRICS expansion, he literally uses this term, BRICS expansion, and the potential of China, Russia, Iran, and the global south uniting around a new currency system backed by the wealth of their own commodities in their possession is a real threat to the US dollar. He's saying that commodity encumbrance, he uses this term to say that there's a growing possibility of these resource-rich nations like Russia will actually use their commodities as finance, as collateral to increase credit and to increase their ability to invest. That you have China and Saudi Arabia interest in trading in Chinese yuan for oil and other commodities. You have Russia's pursuit of an international reserve currency actually underway. And you have this idea of a BRICS coin being floated about. And all of this is presenting a major threat to the future of the US dollar. In that what he is saying is that it could lead to huge inflation. Because what will happen to the US dollar if alternatives start to kick into the world economy is that creditors and financial institutions and major corporations trading in the dollar will begin to raise their prices due to a drop in demand, right? Because there will be less demand for dollars. So now it's time to drop. What has happened to Europe? Europe has been deindustrialized. Europe has been made vassals of the United States. And what has that done? Well, it's allowed the dollar to inflate because it has increased demand for the dollar by weakening the euro and weakening Europe's economy, ergo strengthening the US's economy. Even if it is artificial, even if it is temporary, it nonetheless serves that function. So I say that the United States' answer to fading imperial hegemony here is war and more war. War and more of it. It's an inherent feature of this system of neoliberalism that the neocons oversee, of this neoliberal imperial system. It's a permanent and very profitable industry with the weapons manufacturers and Wall Street taking huge cuts of profits. And then you have the ruling elite calculating it cannot compete with China and Russia right now. And this sentiment has been expressed in the Atlantic Council think tank and in successive national security strategies of great power and strategic competition, that they can't compete. So it's time to militarily become more and more aggressive. And so this should come as no surprise because the U.S. is not targeting singular enemies here. It's not just China. It's not just Russia. It's about this alternative development model that is emerging, that countries are joining onto in very different ways, maybe, but that's what multipolarity is. Everyone has their own maybe national development model that is respected. These countries aren't trying to change each other, but they are pursuing common goals, one of which is de-dollarization, diversifying the economic portfolio, asserting sovereignty, growing on their own terms, and shaking off US diktats and also the burden of US and Western financial institutions. So Ukraine is just a testing ground for this larger imperial agenda, of stopping this. And so that's why they're planning for the next war, because they can't stop. If they were to stop and just say, let's focus on Ukraine for now, because it's first, because Russia is first, well, that would limit them. That would limit their ability to do what they need to do sooner rather than later, because this is also a war of attrition in that these countries like China and Russia, time is on their side. They have respected development models. They have public support. They have accomplishments that they can cite. They have legitimacy on the world stage. I've showed you the study that has been conducted. There are numerous studies like this, but there's a recent study that shows that more than 60-70% of the entire global South stands with Russia and China as partners. So Russia and China, time is on their side. They are on the side that's growing, dare I say, that's winning. And the United States is trying to wrestle back what it is losing, and it's not going to succeed, but it is threatening World War III, and that's what I wanted to get across. It is doing this. We have to understand that it is threatening World War III, and it's preparing for it as we speak. That's what's happening, and we have to push through the misinformation about this, because so much misinformation exists about this very phenomenon. And you have so many people who are not looking at each side of this. Some people look at Russia, others look at China. Both are important. They're interconnected. This is all interconnected. It is a two-front singular war against the emerging multipolar world, the emerging order led by the global South and led by its biggest and fastest rising powers, Russia and China, with China in the lead, and China being the most important for the U.S. foreign policy establishment and the collective West to destroy and to undermine. But it's not going to work, folks. We will see, though, possibly more escalations and maybe a great power confrontation, a global war. And I don't think anybody wants to see that, because there's no way that cannot lead to a nuclear exchange. All right. That's why I'm covering it here. That's why we need to cover this over and over and over again, and we need to cover correctly. All right, I'm sharing the article once again in the chat. That's the end of the story. All right. Now I want to talk about how the Duran reacted to this as the final story. All right. We went through a lot today. We have 799 viewers and about 705 likes. Great. Amazing, everyone. Keep liking the stream if you haven't yet. For those 96 or so who have not, keep liking the stream, sharing it. Of course, the best way to support this work is patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong, or you can support this work on YouTube. Just hit that join button, and you can also find many other ways to support in the links in the description. One thing I am pushing people to do, though, subscribe for free on Substack. Let's build up this newsletter. I'm going to do this periodically in streams. Tomorrow I have Brian Berletic on. For those of you who are coming on, 11:30 a.m. Eastern time. I'm going to post that event probably shortly after this. I can actually get you all, since you're all here, I can get you all the unlisted link. I'll put that in the chat at the end. So stick around. And so you can hit that notify me when you have that link. And we'll go through a more in-depth military update with Brian about Ukraine. So let's get to what the Duran had to say about China, because I thought this was interesting. You can find this link in the description. They covered the Bierman story in the Financial Times. So let's get this, because I think it's interesting what they say, and I'll definitely add my own commentary to it. But I think it's interesting to note that they are also alarmed, right? The Duran folks who have been covering Russia so astutely in the military operation, they're also concerned about what's going on. Let's hear what they have to say.
Financial Times article where we are looking at ramping up a conflict between the United States and China. Actually, the United States, Japan, and China over Taiwan. And in this video, we are going to talk about one Lieutenant General James Bierman, commanding general of the 3rd Marine Expeditionary Force in the Marine Forces Japan, and what he told the Financial Times in an interview. What do we have going on here?
Well, I think it's extremely disturbing because what General Bierman is saying is that the United States is now straightforwardly preparing for war with China. I mean, you can cut it and spin it in whatever way you like, but he says some really very, very alarming things, very revealing things. He says that the war in Ukraine has taken the course that it has. The reason it's being prolonged is because of the way in which the United States helped arm Ukraine, build it up, set up ammunition depots and fuel depots and fortifications and things of that kind. And he says that they're now doing exactly the same thing in the Pacific. They're working with countries like the Philippines, but above all with Japan, in order to try to build up a military coalition to take on the Chinese. And the way he talks about it is straightforwardly anticipating a future war between the United States and China. Now, I recall that some months ago on a video that we did on the Duran, we had a guest. I can't remember which guest it was, but I think it might have been Larry Johnson, who told us that there was one particular US military official in the Far East who was coming up with all sorts of extremely dangerous plans for waging war against China. Now, I do wonder, reading these comments in the Financial Times, whether that person might have been General Bierman. Just speculating. But regardless of that, what Bierman is saying about the way in which the US and Japan are, for example, integrating their military command structures and how they're building up their defenses and working together to wage war against China. What's clear is that this is not just one official who's gone rogue. It is considered an established policy of the United States government.
So let me just give a little description of that established policy, because yes, what Bierman says, as I covered in the Substack article, that will be posted in the link in the description after this video, is that there is a massive military. This is not new. Okay, this massive military buildup has been happening. What Bierman was describing was, yes, coordination with Japan, but also coordination just in totality in the Asia Pacific, was setting a theater for war with China. And so what he means is that you've had the Indo-Pacific Command, this canoe command structure, or renamed command structure, that is particularly and specifically targeting China and has expanded leaps and bounds since the Obama era, since the pivot to Asia. So much so that you have most of the US's military assets, whether it's personnel, whether it's weaponry, whatever it is that's stationed bases, more than several hundred, they're based in the Asia Pacific. Japan has the most. I believe Japan has, I might be overestimating this, but Japan, I think, has more than 100 U.S. military bases of some particular size. And now you might have remember that just last month, Japan doubled its military budget. And it did so in contravention of its constitution after World War II that was signed, that said it was not going to go above 1% of all GDP because it was never going to fight an offensive war again, as a promise to itself and the world that it wasn't going to play a similar role that it did during World War II. That is being torn up. That is being thrown out the window in order to serve the U.S.'s agenda here. And so you've had so many instances, not just of the militarization, but also of formations of things like the Quad, of AUKUS, of so many different military maneuvers that while they don't have much, let's say, battlefield impact, because there isn't a shooting war going on right now, like the proxy war in Ukraine between China and the United States and Japan, but you do have massive escalations, and you have people like General Bierman, this general in Japan, literally saying that there will be a war because all of this is leading to a war. And that's why we should be alarmed. That's why we're talking about World War III so openly here on this channel.
To prepare for a war with China in the Far East. And I have to say, I find that incredibly alarming. The Chinese, who undoubtedly read the Financial Times, who do in fact read the Financial Times, are going to be extremely alarmed as well. Of course, they will already know an awful lot about this from their own intelligence, and they will be working very hard to counter every one of these moves that are being made by General Bierman and the US and the US's allies in this region. And it has to be said that the battlefields for the next war in the Pacific are being prepared, because that's what this article in the Financial Times is telling us.
Yeah, but the interesting part about all of this is that the U.S. has admitted that it can't fight two wars at one time. Blinken came out a couple of weeks ago and said that the U.S. had to pull out of Afghanistan in order to prepare for Ukraine. Nikolai Patrushev actually said the other day that the withdrawal of the American forces from Ukraine, from Afghanistan, had a lot to do with the U.S. focusing on Ukraine. So the question becomes, if the U.S. is going to focus on China and Taiwan, well, then it's going to have to pull out of Ukraine.
Absolutely. Now, can I just quickly add, because I think it's a point that is important for us as a channel and which we should make, way back, I think it was in the spring or early summer, we had a discussion here on the Duran. You can probably find the video if you research it. And we said at the time that it did look as if the US pullout from Afghanistan had been in order to prepare for the conflict in Ukraine. So, it's nice to see people like Blinken confirming it and Patrushev commenting it.
So, I mean, this is pretty interesting because I can't say I disagree here in that the United States does not actually have the capacity to fight Ukraine and in Taiwan, for example. It doesn't. That's why they're always talking about, oh, well, if we do too much in Ukraine, you hear the US's foreign policy analysts, its military analysts, its strategists, its Pentagon officials. They say, well, we do too much in Ukraine, we'll risk elsewhere. We'll be up for risk elsewhere. Well, there's no bigger risk than trying to fight two proxy wars at the same time, trying to fight two confrontational wars with Russia and China at the same time. I don't think it's possible either. I mean, whether that means a pullout of Ukraine, would it mean taking back the weapons? At this time, you don't have U.S. troops stationed. You have covert training, of course, happening with U.S. military personnel. We've known that since 2014 in Ukraine, but you don't have U.S. soldiers, NATO troops going into confrontation with Russian forces yet. And and that would be World War III, mind you. So they can't do that with Russia and do that with China. There's no possible way. You've heard Douglas McGregor say it. So many have said it. No way. But would that lead to a pullout of Ukraine? That's the big quagmire. That's the quandary that the U.S. finds itself in. It really is. It's a big problem. Let's continue.
Commenting on it, but you heard it first, if you did hear it, on the Duran. just to say that. Now, I agree. I don't think the United States can sustain a war on two fronts. Blinken is saying that. We've had this information from people like Brian Beletic about the shortage of Patriot missiles, for example, that there aren't enough Patriot missiles already to meet all the commitments, and that the more Patriot missile systems the United States sends to Ukraine, the fewer there are for the Pacific, where there are already major gaps and shortages. So at some point, if the plan is indeed going to be war in the Pacific with China, they will have to make a strategic choice. They will have to decide, assuming the war in Ukraine is still going on, they will have to decide between Ukraine or between China. China is, of course, the more important place. I mean, it's strategically vital. So you might say to yourself, well, in that case, sacrifice Ukraine. Except I don't think that is what they're going to do. I think the instinct in Washington is going to be completely different, at least from the side of the neocons. I think the instinct will be try to escalate in Ukraine, try to get Ukraine won in some form, or achieve there something that you can call a victory as quickly as possible before you face up to this conflict with China. And that could result in a lot more pressure for escalation in Ukraine over the next few weeks and months.
I mean, that's happening, right? This video is a few days old, but that's happening, right? You have this intense pressure now to get tanks, right? They want these Leopard 2 tanks. Germany wants the US to give them. The United States wants Germany to give them. The US wants the entire NATO stockpile of these tanks, right? Whether it's Denmark or other countries, give them all up. Give all the tanks to Ukraine soon, right? Because the United States doesn't want this to go on forever. The New York Times has reported this. They don't want this to go on forever in the way that it's going on. Sure, they could enjoy conflict for good, meaning that they could enjoy having Ukraine as a NATO protectorate of some kind, continue to pump it full of weapons, continue to provoke maybe Russia, but they want a strong hand there before they can say, well, let's focus on the next thing. But right now, Ukraine is in what is it's a huge problem. It's a quandary. It's not the position that lends itself to the United States saying, okay, we've done what we needed to do. We've caused enough instability. We have a situation that's favorable to our interests, and we can just go. No, because the minute they do that, Ukraine will fall, right? Ukraine's proxy government would not last a minute should that support leave, should that support be withdrawn. So yes, they're going to try to push this and try to make a fantasy into a reality, meaning make Russia's defeat a reality, or at least get Ukraine into a strong enough position where it's on its way to defeat so it can focus on the next war. That's not going to happen in my estimation. I don't see anything like that becoming reality. But nonetheless, this is the problem that the U.S. empire, this overreach, imperial overreach, this is the problem that is presented by it, and that this is the problem that's been caused by it, right? This is a major issue for the empire. It cannot face up to in the past, right? It cannot face up to these two big rising powers. Like in the past, it was able to maybe extend itself through many different means all over the world. Yeah, it could be in Afghanistan and Iraq with an invasion and occupation. Sure. It could also be leveraging its military apparatus all across the Middle East. It could also be expanding command centers and logistical operation and special operations all over the African continent. It could be doing covert ops in Latin America and the Caribbean. It could be doing a whole lot of things, but it's never had to face up to two powers, let alone global South powers that assert sovereignty in a way that is uncompromising, right? This is uncompromising sovereignty. When it comes to Russia's red line of Ukraine being in NATO, this is not something Russia will ever give into. Defending Donbass, Russia, you've heard Putin, you've heard Russia's government. How many times have you heard them say, we will never turn our backs on Donbass ever again? It was one of the biggest mistakes we've ever made. China has said over and over and again, we will not go against not only international law, not only the U.S. and China joint communiques, but also the historic reality that Taiwan is part of China, something that's been a reality for thousands of years with interruptions like Japanese colonization and U.S. aggression. But nonetheless, there is a one China principle, and that principle has historic weight to it that will never be turned against. China will never turn against it. So the United States has never had to deal with this kind of problem. It's always tried to pick on weaker opponents. It's always tried to pick on weaker countries that were just trying to get out of the rubble that they found themselves in, from whether it was a colonial situation or something else. But it's never had to face countries that have both shaken off those shackles and are now trying to build something new and have uncompromising positions about their territorial integrity and sovereignty. So, yeah, the United States can't do what it wants right now. It can't. Let's continue for a couple more minutes.
Yeah, I think the neocon plan has always been to go after Russia first, and that opens the way towards China. I don't think the neocons are going to move away from that plan.
No, I agree. I completely agree. But of course, what's happening is the opposite of what they intended. You have a situation where Russia is again advancing in Ukraine. We've just done a program about this, but it looks as if the Bakhmut-Soledar situation is about to be resolved in Russia's favor. Perhaps the Donbass situation is as well. We did a recent program about the enormous military buildup that the Russians are now engaging in. We're getting more economic figures coming out of Russia, which suggests that the economy there is now in strong recovery. And so, I mean, the attempt to create an economic crisis is not working. We're getting more reports too that oil prices over the course of 2023 might start to increase, which will plug any remaining holes in Russia's budget, which they're able to cover anyway from their savings. So, it's not working. Breaking Russia isn't working. But they're not going to admit that. Now, I saw a tweet by a retired US general, Ben Hodges, and he said, no, time isn't working in Russia's favor. Time is working in Ukraine's favor. Ukraine is going to win this war. Ukraine is going to take Crimea back. They're going to have Crimea back by August. That's what he said. So you can see what we're being set up for. It looks like a major escalation in Ukraine, because ultimately, if you're going to deal with China, you can't deal with China whilst Ukraine is unresolved, since negotiating a truce with the Russians on Russian terms is ideologically impossible. You have to escalate instead and hope that that gives you the victory that you gambled everything on.
So, I mean, I would just add to that, and then we'll end the video portion of this. I would just add to that it's not, it's not just that Russia and China are closer together, right? Because that is a huge threat, and it's one that the United States cannot reconcile. It's one that is being produced too by this phenomenon, by this increasing aggression. So the more that the United States provokes Russia, the closer it gets to China. The more that the United States provokes and wages war, proxy wars, and other kinds of economic, diplomatic, all kinds of new kind of like this Cold War agenda, the more that it levies that onto China, the closer that China gets to Russia. That is definitely true. But it's also that there is just this organic development phenomenon happening where you have China and Russia saying, well, we are going to actually lead a world that is independent and separate from U.S. diktats, from the collective West diktats. It's not just going to be their game anymore. It's going to be a world where everyone can have the possibility of thriving, where every nation can say, we will develop in this way. They can handle their internal disputes, how they handle them, their internal conflicts, their contradictions along class and nationality and all kinds of other lines. We'll figure that out on our own in the global South. And then we will chart a course of independence through uniting around certain very important aspects and elements to sovereignty, like financial independence, like real financial independence. This is what was not resolved during the anti-colonial movements of the 20th century. This financial component, the economic liberation, the economic freedom. China and Russia are now saying, we will lead a big part of the path toward this. Of course, countries will have to decide on their own whether they want to join, and it is absolutely a prerequisite that more and more join. But institutions like BRICS, institutions like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, integration projects like the Belt and Road Initiative, all of these developments, right? Integration of Latin America as well, right? You have Africa, China cooperation, Russia, Africa cooperation. You have Russia, China, Iran building a kind of an axis of resistance as well. You have Syria, you have other countries as well trying to join in. But you have China and Russia leading the de-dollarization campaign through BRICS. You have Russia and China discussing with their partners, trading in their own respective currencies. You have this coming into fruition. You have many countries from Algeria, Argentina, Saudi Arabia even discussing joining in on this, getting in on this. You already know that Saudi Arabia, UAE, and countries like this, they've already been trading, not necessarily out of the US dollar, but they've already been building up infrastructure, relationships, trade agreements. You saw the China Arab Summit earlier at the end of 2022. Just all of these developments, what do they point to? They point to a world that is becoming more and more unhappy with US domination and hegemony. That's what it points to. And we are going to see where this goes, okay? Because, you know, we are in, I think, a very watershed moment in the world. It's a watershed moment. This is a moment where the world can go one of two directions. It can go in a unipolar direction where the United States and the collective West get to dominate, super exploit, and wage war and threaten possibly a global war with two rising powers in the East, global South countries, mind you, countries that identify with the world's majority. Or it can go in the multipolar direction where Russia and China, because just of their scale, their influence, their economic size, they lead a world where all countries have a more powerful voice, especially global South countries, in determining their own affairs and ensuring that their sovereignty is not infringed upon, yet there is still fertile and favorable conditions for real cooperation, what China calls win-win cooperation. So that is the two directions the world can go in at a very broad level. Of course, there are many intricacies to that, and all countries will have their own development paths. But that is the broad trend in the world. And that is why the United States is trying to prepare this two-front war. They're trying to extend themselves to the point of waging war against Russia and China because they know that these two countries are the biggest dominoes. They think that if you can tip them, then this end of history theory will become reality once again in their minds, that the United States and the collective West will be they will be the supremacists, the imperial supremacists, the imperial hegemonists for the rest of time. Well, newsflash, a big alert. I don't know if this is a big story. It ain't going to happen because the trend is too strong for the US's capabilities, in my opinion, and my estimation. Of course, we'll have to see how things go, but it definitely seems that this feels like desperation and that the United States is going to have to make some really tough calculations in the coming weeks and months around Ukraine, around Taiwan, all this war preparations with China. What will the United States really do here? I think we're going to see stagnation on many fronts. And when you have stagnation and potentially crisis, whether it's political crisis, military crisis, or economic crisis, or maybe all of them, which is very a very real possibility for the United States and NATO in the NATO sphere. When you have that, well, you can have a very dangerous situation on your hands, because there are forces that are willing to try to take leaps and bounds over what is reality and maybe lead this world into a global conflagration we've never seen before. So that's why we have to pierce through this misinformation. That's why we have to ensure that we are aware and understand the stakes in front of us, so that we can join in our own ways in the resistance to this dangerous war mongering agenda led by the US imperial albatross. All right, everyone, that was a marathon. That was a marathon of stories. It was a great stream so far, really good stream. So we have 767 watching, and we ended up with 849 likes. So great ratio. Thanks so much to all who attended this evening. I'm going to try to get through the chat quickly, but I may have to end it short. But I do like to go through the chat, especially for those folks who gave super chats. I'm going to shout you out, and I'll shout out the members as well who are in the chat. Of course, everyone, before you go here, do consider signing up on Patreon. We have a lot of updates and upgrades that need to be made. I want to be able to build an income that can also support others who are helping me. That would be great. Not quite there yet in terms of a consistent process financially, but I am moving in that direction. So patreon.com/DannyHaiphong is the best place to support. You can also do so. You can also do so in other ways in the link in the description. So you can, in the links in the description, there are one-time options, yearly on Substack. You can do yearly on Patreon too, through the tiers. You can also join on YouTube. We have a great YouTube community here that has been growing. You can join on YouTube. Hit that join button, $5 a month. All right. And by doing so, you get some access, you get some early notifications. And, you know, I am taking now both guest suggestions as well as I am also taking questions for guests as well. So for those who subscribe on Patreon, you can, in YouTube, you can suggest guests and questions for guests. So tomorrow I have Brian Berletic, for example. If you sign up on Patreon, get me a question. I will definitely do my best. If not, definitely ask it to him tomorrow. All right. All right, I'm going to go through the chat now. JM, thank you. Thanks for being such a loyal member. And thanks for your contribution. Hello to the moderators. Hello to the members. Hello, Big Teal, member of this channel. Thank you so much. Salutations to you, Big Teal. Thank you. Let's see. Thanks to the moderators, of course. Let's keep going. Cheryl, hello to you. Thanks for joining. Ware, who's also a moderator, thanks to you for being a member as well. Let's keep going. Oh, I see a super chat below. I will get to you as I move down. Thanks so much for that generous super chat. All right, I'm going to try to do this quickly because I got to wake up for Brian tomorrow, all right? And I got to get some stuff up for that. Let's see. All right. Same members. All right. This stream was great. I mean, you know, definitely to a place I am more used to now. So yeah, definitely testing out this algorithm as well in the new year. It's been quite interesting, to say the least, with some weird bugs in YouTube too. It's a very strange platform. But nonetheless, this was definitely a good stream where, yeah, this is where I've been for the last several months. And so thank you so much for making it here. Thank you so much for making this a very lively stream Mexican Stalin, thank you so much for coming. Russia already had legal excuse to use nukes when Ukraine attacked part of Russia's nuclear triad. Yeah, true. Russia has been very, very, very reserved, right? It has been very patient. It's used strategic patience to a high degree. So thank you for that comment. Thanks for being a member. All right. I see 2 super chats on the bottom, but I know that there were a few other super chats. So let me try to get to them. Here we go. John Hart, U.S. will destroy everything to maintain control. Thanks for the super chat. I agree. It is really on a path of self-destruction right now. Really, that's a conclusion that we should all be making right now. Thank you so much, David, for the super sticker. Thank you so much for being a consistent viewer and for that generosity. Let's see. All right, everybody. All right. Let's see. While I'm going, I'll tell you a funny story. Last night, there was like a street guy. I used to work with homeless individuals. He had gone into our building and he was just chilling right outside of my door. It was very awkward. And my door, it's an old apartment. So my door was like, his movements were causing the door to move, like. And so I look out, of course, the peephole in this old apartment is I can't really see out of it. So I'm like, who is that? I thought it was just somebody next door who was trying to find their shit. So I didn't think anything of it for the first 15 minutes. Then I go out there and I see him. He's chilling. I think he was smoking something. It smelled pretty bad. It wasn't weed. I don't know what it was. But I was like, all right, man, sorry, you can't be up front here. Where are you sleeping tonight? And he was really it seemed like he was so intoxicated that he didn't really know where he was. But he left and that was that. Thanks, JM, for this. For me, for the contribution. Thank you so much, JM, for the contribution. Again, for me, those situations are sad, because it's like nobody should have to live like that. It's ridiculous that we live in a system. This is a system of the empire in decline where you have hundreds of thousands of people who are homeless, and it only takes some number in the millions or maybe the low billions to fix this. And you have 858 billion going to the war machine. That's the system we live in. That is a system we live in. That's what's fueling geopolitical conflict, is a system like that. All right, everybody. All right. Let's see. So that's one story. And then right after that, as if that wasn't strange enough, something started beeping in my apartment last night. And I'm like, of course, my wife's working overnight. And I'm like, all right, it's really usually quiet, maybe too quiet sometimes in this apartment. So I'm like, all right, I'm just trying to chill. It starts beeping. And I'm like, what's that beep? It's not the fire, whatever, smoke detectors, carbon monoxide, none of that. I go by the plug and I have this vacuum, like mini vacuum charger plugged in, and it's beeping. And I'm like, okay, I'll unplug. But it's been in there for days. This is a strange shit. I was like, it was getting me kind of paranoid, actually. I do have some paranoia in me, given how much we are kept track of. You know what I mean? So I do have some of that paranoia. I remember when I first had a BlackBerry and I was an activist, before I became a real journalist, my BlackBerry got hacked by some bug, and it was sending me really kind of overtly, definitely like a bot, but it was overtly political messages, very violent ones, like I'm going to get you, bomb you like this, get you like that. And I'm like, this is creepy. So I literally like reset my BlackBerry. This was 2012. I was like, this is strange. Anyway, it's always interesting living in the belly of the beast. That's for sure. Always an interesting time, especially when you have so many people struggling. All right. So I'm not seeing many super chats, super stickers. I'm trying to fast forward kind of fast here because I know there are a few on the bottom, some generous ones. So let me do this. Let's see what time it is. 10:32. Okay, I'm entering the last half hour here of the chat. What a lively chat. Thanks so much. All right. For those who haven't liked the chat, maybe you have all liked the stream. We're at 898 likes. If you haven't, though, just hit that like button now. get us closer to 1,000 likes before we head out of here for the evening. I will make that stream public right after this, but I'm going to send, I forgot, a lot of people left already, but for you 575 who stick around, I will send that unlisted link for you to hit the notify button with. Here you have Christopher Dobby. Thanks so much for the super chat. U.S. will fight both Russia and China. The empire has no other option. You are right. Thanks so much for the super chat. Thank you so much, Charlotte May, for the super sticker. And I know now we're getting to the end. I don't think there were that many others. Oh, here we go. Patrick Monstar, super sticker, $10. Thank you so much. And then, what time and zone is a stream with Brian as notary? Eastern time, 11:30 a.m. So what is that? 11:30 Bangkok time. That is also if you're in the UK. What is that? 5 hours difference? 4:30 p.m. I believe, or 3:30. I don't know. UK confuses me. But Pacific time, that would be 8:30 a.m. Pacific. Let me get you that unlisted link, everyone. All right, stick around. Do not leave, because I like to do. I want to reward your viewership for those who are really looking forward to this conversation tomorrow. All right. I want to send you this link because I can get to it from my YouTube. So let me do that. Here we go. Brian Berletic live. I am going to get the shareable link for you. And now I'm going to paste it. Oh, look at Pamela with an amazing contribution of 50 Canadian dollars. Thank you so much for that very generous contribution. Now you have in the chat. You really do rock, Pamela. That's an amazing contribution. Amazing. Now you have in the chat the link to tomorrow's unlisted. It's unlisted for now. It'll probably be public sometime soon after this before I head to bed. All right. Some people are saying thank you for the personal stories, said Andy here at the end. Sorry, yes, great work. Andy said thanks for you make the work real. Thanks so much. And then you have some great work so far. I love these comments. Thanks so much for the kind words, everyone. Yeah, I like to tell personal stories when there's a little when I'm doing the chat. Why not? Right? What else am I? What you don't want to hear silence, right? Not at least not for too long. So yeah, this was a marathon. This was over 2 hours long. Oh, also I have to thank Rockfin community. Thanks so much, and thank you to who was it that gave the tip? There you are. Thank you to Copeland Morris for the tip on Rockfin. Appreciate it. So for those who just came to the stream, says Bobby, it is, but you can rewind and start from the beginning. If you're just catching it now, the playback will be available at the end of this. And of course, drop a like while you're here if you're just joining, because that will continue to boost it even after we're done. So yeah, tomorrow, all right, last call. You got the link. I'll put it in the thing again. Brian Berletic, tomorrow morning, 11:30 a.m. Eastern for me. That's going to be an adventure. I'm going to let Brian do a lot of the heavy lifting tomorrow because it is mostly going to be about the military situation. And then, of course, we'll get into some broad stuff because that's the one thing I really enjoy about Brian is that he gets the big picture. All right, everyone. That's it for me for tonight. Salutation, salute. Remember, before you go, consider signing up monthly on Patreon, patreon.com/DannyHaiFong. That's the best way. I mean, you can do annual subscription there too through one of the tiers. Best way to support is there. Of course, you can join on YouTube for a monthly $5 a month. You can join on Substack annually. You can do one-time donations in the links in the description. All of these links are in the description. And you can also find my Telegram in the link tree. You want to get on that because it's also kind of like Substack, where if you sign up for free, if you follow my Telegram and you sign up for free on Substack, you have two areas where you get notifications that YouTube may never be consistent about. But I am consistent. I will notify you. So if you sign up for free on Substack, even if you can't do an annual subscription, Link is in the description. I'm going to keep plugging that because I want to build up that newsletter. I do write original articles too, so you get some perks there. And, it's a pretty good platform to also financially support people, to be honest. It's probably my favorite out of all of them. It just so happens that Patreon is my biggest community. It is the best place because of that, and I'm able to really keep up with it. But Substack is also a really good place. I do not discriminate. All right, everyone. Look at that. Big Teal says gift subscription to people in the chat. If you like, click on the $ below. Do that. Give people a gift subscription. That's an amazing gift. It might, Christmas might have passed, but you know what? People are celebrating in China. They're celebrating the new year, right? They're celebrating for a long time. So why not join with the Chinese people, celebrate, give a gift subscription? Thanks so much, Big Teal, for that plug. You can do that right now if you want, or tomorrow when I'm on tomorrow, you can do that. Whatever you like it. All right. And Notary says Austin thumbnail. Thank you so much, of course, to Loa Socialisti. They helped me out with the thumbnails, and it's amazing. It's great, and it's really been a great experience. And they're also very smart on all things political, and also with helping me manage my own mental process with this media apparatus. And also I have someone help me out with shorts as well, someone who contacted me on Instagram, which you can find in my link tree as well. And that's been a great experience thus far, a very new one, but hopefully that collaboration will continue. And that's why financial support is so important, because I want to get these folks something. I'm not at the capacity where I can hire employees, but something. It's just, it's not right. All right, everyone, take good care. Peace out. Good night. See you tomorrow. Bye-bye.